Hello, everyone, and welcome to Leaders of Today, Teens to Titans. Today, I want to introduce you to my guest, Kamini Wood, a life coach who specializes in helping high performers overcome self-sabotage. She empowers individuals to cultivate self-compassion, set boundaries, and embrace their authentic selves. In today's discussion, we will focus on how high stress and internal pressures she experienced as a teen impacts the work she does now with teens, emerging adults, and parents. We will learn how this journey of dismantling her own perfectionism helped encourage others to do the same. She now uses those experiences to empower teens to see themselves as more than just their achievements. So without further ado, let's jump right into our conversation. You're listening to Today's Leaders, from Teens to Titans. Hi, I'm Lorraine Connell, a teen leadership coach. I transitioned from teaching chemistry to coaching teens in leadership, helping them realize they can do hard things. We've often believed that leadership is an innate trait, but it's actually a skill that you build and improve. On this show, you'll meet today's leaders who share their teenage experiences, revealing how they developed confidence, direction, and the tools to become the leaders they are now. You'll discover how you or the teens in your life have the potential to become confident leaders, even if it doesn't seem possible. Thanks for joining me today, Kamini.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So my first question for everyone that I interview is, let's go back to your teenage experience and tell me what it was like to be a teen for you and how that experience shaped you into the leader you are today and shaped the work that you do.
Such a great question, because I think oftentimes we want to avoid going back to our teen years.
For sure.
Oh my goodness. My teen years included a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, but it kind of dates a little bit further back. As I've done my work, I've recognized that this started pretty early on for me. I grew up in a predominantly white community, and obviously I stood out. I had a different sounding name. I looked slightly different. So from a very early age, I did take on some people-pleasing tendencies, because at the end of the day, most of us want to belong and we want to be accepted. And so for me, the way that my little 6-year-old self figured that out was make sure people are happy with you and don't rock the boat or make waves and just kind of go with the flow. Then, of course, you add on the fact that I had immigrant parents and they were working really hard to provide for my sister and I. And so therein lies where the perfectionist started to take hold, because really at the end of the day, I did not want to burden them. Mm-hmm. So then you take that into your teen years now, and that's where it really took hold for me, because it was all about performance. I strived to do really well in school because it didn't matter to me. It's part of my personality. I'm not going to dispute that. But also part of it was, if I'm doing my part and I'm performing, my parents don't have to worry about me. And so there was this desire to continue being perfect and not creating waves, not doing anything to rock the boat. We're not going to create conflict. So it was a little bit of perfectionism and people-pleasing tied into one. And I operated that way through, teen years into adulthood. Only after I became a mother, and I saw my children mirroring those behaviors through that preteen stage, did I stop and recognize, whoa, this is learned behavior. I need to take a step back and do the hard work of paying attention. And so that's really where I started to go back and learn about where these stories and these beliefs came from. Because really, at the end of the day, it is about beliefs, right? And so I did that hard work. But through that, I recognized that my calling was really to help others, because ultimately, had I had this when I was a teenager to help me understand it, things would have shifted. And I'm not saying, I always say things happen. There's a purpose for what we go through. And I truly believe mine was to now take this information and these experiences, and now my training, because I've trained in very specific modalities, and now I can pay it forward so that others don't have to necessarily go the same path. They will have their own journey, right? There's still going to be challenges along the way, but they don't have to be the same ones repeated. And that's really what I wanted for my kids too, is there's going to be other challenges, but we don't have to generationally repeat the same things over and over again.
There's a lot in that. And I love a lot of what you said resonated so much with me. I think when I became a parent, I started to see things very differently. And I think it's interesting. I'm still discovering where my perfectionism came from. And I think you do a really good job at shaping how perfectionism sort of evolves through that journey. It wasn't like my parents telling me that I had to be perfect. It was I didn't want to be a burden. And also, your statement about the people pleasing was a result of wanting to belong and be accepted. And there's so much power in sort of identifying how you got to those behaviors in order to dismantle the impact. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about how the evolution of realizing some of those behaviors and reflecting back on them, and how do you help your own children and then the teens that you're working with? How do you help them dismantle those beliefs that are inherent in the way that they see life?
Yeah. So for me, I will just be totally honest and transparent. It wasn't easy, that work of dismantling it. And also, it's so easy to start looking at those experiences and potentially get caught up in some type of blame game. Like, oh, this happened to me or this occurred. And for me, it was doing the work to recognize, yes, I can come to radical acceptance if certain circumstances were the case. I mean, I'm not going to change the fact that, yeah, there were some people that were very critical and said some really not nice things to me.
Right.
And I'm not condoning it. By the same token, I can now look at that with the lens of, oh, that shaped certain ideas. So for me, the dismantling was go ahead and look at it, but look at it with some compassion and look at it without judgment, right? Because at the end of the day, this isn't about a blame game. It's about curiosity and understanding. And through that, once I got to that place of just, I can come to radical acceptance and also really employ this idea of non-judgment, but just curiosity, that allowed me to see things more clearly. Because I truly say this to everybody. It's like awareness is that first step. It's not the only step. It's the first step. But we have to become aware of what those things are. And then we can take our values-based action. And so for me, it was, okay, now that I'm aware of this, and I understand where these stories came from, what do I want for myself and what do I want for my kids? Because one of my true values is motherhood. Like it absolutely is. It's a core value. And sure, it's shifted and ebbed and flowed as my kids have gotten older because I have some adult children now, right? So it changes a little bit, but the value itself was there. And so that was enough for me to say, okay, I'm willing to look at this and to then figure out where did this story come from? Again, without judgment, but then knowing that I have the capacity to change that narrative because it's really a belief system. And with that belief, I'm the one who's giving it energy. So if I'm the one who's buying into that story, I can also say, well, that's no longer true, right? It's no longer true that I have to overgive and overfunction for people to love me. Yes, that was the story that my 7-year-old, 13-year-old, 20-year-old, 25-year-old, 30-year-old, right? Go down the list. But now I don't have to. I can say, oh, I can give as much as I can. And that the giving and the overfunctioning doesn't make me lovable, right? That comes from who I am as a person through my essence. And so that's what I've really worked hard on opening up dialogue with my kids on. As I mentioned, I have some adults, their age ranges from 23 to 11. So I know that I've seen the evolution in my own kids and how they even act within their own social groups, right? I've seen them go through high school, and that's a really trying time because there's the normal, right? I want to be normal. I want to fit in. And how do you correlate that with who you are as a person? And so for me, it's really about helping teenagers and emerging adults understand who they are and what actually matters to them as their own person, and then making them choices. So that then when they do maybe do something that wouldn't be considered normal, right? Meaning, like, for instance, like I know my older son right now, he does not drink because he's an athlete. And so that would be considered abnormal for a college student, right? But he's created his own normal because he's got a true value of performance and showing up and being present and being able to perform his sport and creating space for people to really, these teenagers and young adults, to feel connected to that. That's how we make that change.
Mm. I love that. I love that a lot because I think in the work that I do, I will be in a room of people and I'll ask them to define leadership. And what I'm hoping is that they realize that we all have a different definition of what leadership is. And so I guess my question to you is, how has your definition of success evolved through this evolution of your own?
Oh my gosh, it's changed. It's turned itself on its head because success always was measured by an external factor or something that I did, right? It was the achievement measuring. And that's how I always operated. And for me, success is, how am I feeling? How present am I? What is that experience like? Where am I in terms of my being and not my doing? And that's where I've shifted. For me personally, that's how has shifted. Sure. Do I still say like certain things are a success because I have achieved them, like especially running my own business? Yes, of course, there's are those metrics. But that used to be the only definition of success. For me, success is having those moments that, especially with my kids, that when you're present with each other, you're not then doing anything, you're being. To me, that's success because I'm truly engaged in just having those moments, because those are the ones that actually for me matter most.
Yeah, and that makes me think of our core values, right? So if we don't really know what our core value is or are, then we can't truly live into or know what success is. And that's one of the things that I'll do with teens is ask them to define their core values. And they're like, I don't know what you mean. And it's really interesting. That's one of the things that we missed. I know that I missed it as a child. And I didn't even know it was something to even consider as an
Oh,
individual
yeah.
until I was in my 40s. How did you come to know what your core values were?
For me personally, it was through the self development work, because to your point, it's not something people talk about. And normally, what ends up happening, the evolution is, we're in our family of origin and we grow up. And, yes, society and culture has their emphasis and their weight and bearing on, how we were brought up. But ultimately, we just continue going down the path. We don't take the time to actually say, what's really meaningful to me? And so, yes, the work that I do with teens and my emerging adult clients, same concept. And they'll kind of look at me like a deer in headlights. Like, what do you mean core values? What are you talking about? But once they start to recognize what we're really talking about is what matters to them, what lights them up, what actually, because again, so often we're driven by these things like, well, I need to be motivated. And if you really dial down motivation, for instance, you aren't connected to the thing you're doing,
Yeah.
that's going to be a tough hill to climb. Versus if you can find some connection to the thing that you're setting a goal for, you're going to find that motivation. So that's why values are so important. They're our ground zero. And I've also found, especially in the work that I do with the high performers and just the inner critic, so often you can use that as again, that ground zero, that place to come back home. It's okay. I know my mind is spinning out. My inner critic is going off on a tangent. Okay, what's actually meaningful to me? What matters to me? Right. And take an action based on something that matters to you. It gets you out of that rabbit hole thinking.
How do you get teens to sort of identify that they are self-sabotaging and in that high performance due to reward in a sense? Like, how do you get them to see that negative impact that has on who they are as a person?
For me, a lot of times the work revolves around having them actually talk me through what they're experiencing. Meaning, what does that not just feel like in terms of emotions, but what's the experience like? And how do you feel after? Right. Because once they can actually put words to that experience, they start to step into observer mode and they start to see, oh, like I'm chasing something here. And oh, wow, I'm actually really tired. I'm working with a really high achieving young woman right now. And it took a few different times of conversation, right? A few sessions, but she said, I continually push myself harder and harder. And really, this all comes down to honestly fear of failure and also fear of disappointing her parents. The only way to get there, though, is to have her talk me through what's the experience like. What's that? Because if I tried to go at it too cognitively, it would have been shut down versus talk to me about how does your body feel during that? Because that says so much.
Well, and I am finding when I'm trying to work with schools about developing a leadership program within their schools, they'll send me those high achieving students who are already so spread that it's hard for me to get past that mentality. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do these high achieving teens feel when they feel like they're the only ones who can do these things?
I think what they feel, truthfully, is they actually feel burnt out, but they don't know how to name that.
Right.
So the way it comes out usually is in anxiety, some type of anxious behavior. And then they might even describe it as I can't concentrate on anything because their mind is literally jumping from one thing to the next. But really, that's a protective mechanism. It's the part of them that's trying to protect them from all of it, as well as just that fear of failure. So the way that they'll describe it to us is a lot of them will say, I procrastinate or I can't concentrate on anything. They'll even probably self-diagnose as having ADHD. And I'm not saying that's not an actual diagnosis, but many of them will go down that path because their mind is pinging so fast about all these things because they're actually overwhelmed and overstressed. They are spread so thin, but they don't know or they can't see it because they're so close to it. And so our work is really about having them step back with you. So it's almost like the best analogy I have is pulling them out of the forest and walking with them so that to give them a little bit like we're climbing a little bit of a ladder. So we're looking at it from a bird's eye view and now they can see the full picture. And once they see that, then it scares them because as a high achiever, they're like, but if I change anything, everything's going to crumble. So it's not about changing everything. It's about making tweaks along the way, right? So that these tweaks can then together create a different experience for them.
I love that because I was in it, I was like, I want to work with those kids. They're amazing. And I've realized in the last 5 years as I stepped away from teaching that you're right. It's burnout. We're teaching kids how to be burnt out at a very young age. It's also preventing them from learning how to delegate, right? And that was something that I realized that when we take only that top 10% of high achievers and we're like, but they'll do this and they'll do that. And then, and it's almost a joke with some educators are like, oh, so-and-so's doing it. She's doing everything.
She's got it.
Right. And that, we're not realizing the impact that we're putting in the hands of that child. And the child, back to that people pleasing, doesn't even know how to say no because if they're in it, everything's going to fall apart.
Yes. And just a little caveat or a tangent to what you just said. Yes, it's the people pleasing and also in the lack of being able to delegate. I think part of it also we're teaching them not to ask for help.
100%.
That it's not okay. If we're a high achiever, we've always got it. It would be terrible for us to ask for help. I've seen it time and time again, especially with high achievers in school who have always gotten it and understood, and then they're struggling in a class and they literally isolate and they just go within because that fear of asking for help on something, we've taught them that they should always have it. They should always know. What do you mean you need help? And so they won't ask for help.
Yeah. Well, and I think of when I was teaching, how I didn't want my students to know that I was shifting to plan B. I would just do it, right? It was that fear of letting them know that I could make a mistake or that I wasn't ready or something went wrong. And me then realizing years later that message said to every one of those kids in that classroom that you can't also make a mistake because the person you're looking at is saying they don't make mistakes, and the impact that has as a leader when you're not willing to accept responsibility or acknowledge that you're not perfect, you're sending the message to these high achievers that it must be possible because Miss Connell hasn't made a mistake or she hasn't told us that she makes mistakes.
Right. The same goes for parents. I do end up working with a lot of parents and we have the similar conversations where it's showing your children that you are human and that it is okay. And that you don't, so many parents are also high achievers who are overscheduling themselves and holding themselves to this really ridiculous high standard. They haven't done that work. What I said earlier, my kids were emulating my behavior. That's happening time and time again. And so these high achieving kids are watching their parents and they're taking in that message that it's not okay. It's not okay to take a step back. They're taking in this message that if my day isn't completely booked, I must be lazy.
Yes. Yeah. And the impact that has and the trickle down effect that has is not something that we ever wanted or intended to create for our children. But you're right. When you see it happening in your kids, it's when that mirror is held up in front of your face and you're like, I don't want to look at it, or I'm going to look at it and make a change. And I think it's so fascinating to me how you decided when you started to see your children emulating that behavior that you were like, listen, I think there's something happening here. I'm going to start with me. I'm not
Yes.
going
And
to
it's
fix my kids.
Yes. And that is such a great point because I think oftentimes we have to do that really hard work of taking a look at ourselves. I talk about this in the context of just conscious parenting and mindful parenting. It does start with us. And again, this isn't about blame or shame or judgment. It's just to say, let me become aware of how I'm showing up because that is going to have an effect on our children because that's what they're watching. They're watching it. And even if, to your point, we're not intentionally trying to do something, but they're having these experiences and they're making it mean something. And that's where our work is work on ourselves so then we can aid our children and support our children on what meaning they're making of it and how they're then, what's that internal dialogue for themselves.
Yeah. And you mentioned this at the beginning about looking at things without judgment. And I think for me, that was one of the hardest things for me to do. Do you have any tips on how to evaluate your behavior or others' behavior without that judgment and shame?
Yeah, I lean into Chris Neff's work with self-compassion, right? Kindness over judgment. So it's just as we're going into just paying attention to what you're saying, and as you recognize, wow, that's a pretty judgy statement, just leaning into, okay, well, what's another way I could look at this with a kind eye? That could be one way to do it. The other thing I often say to people is go with curiosity. So when you're going, especially as my reflection on how I was brought up, and I could have easily gone into, wow, my parents worked all the time and they didn't pay enough attention to me. And that would be very judgy. Instead, it was very curious based, like, okay, so that's interesting. My parents were immigrants. What did that mean? Right. And then take yourself down that. So my advice is stay curious rather than making connections and assumptions, if that makes sense, like the distinction between the two, right? Because if you stay in curiosity, you're more apt to stay out of judgment versus if you're ready to make conclusions, you've already entered the judgment world.
Yeah. And the chance of that assumption being what it is wrong and telling yourself a story that isn't the truth is so commonplace. It's really fascinating to think about that. I wanted to reflect a little bit on your parents' story of being immigrants and feeling that pressure of having to perform and having to make sure everything is perfect because of the judgment coming from the outside. Is there anything that you can share about that experience?
I love your question because only after I did my work could I look at it differently. I think when I was in it, there was a lot of just what is wrong with them? I don't get it. Like, what is this about? Right. Because you're in it again, too close to the situation. For me, now I look at it with so much empathy and also just compassion for the fact that really they were in a place of really feeling like they had to provide for my sister and I. And they themselves were, they were quote unquote different. And so they had to work through their own issues of how do we fit in, right? Because I at least had the benefit of being born in the States and I certainly sound completely American. People would have no idea that I'm of the Indian descent unless they actually paid attention to my name and had a conversation with me, right? But my parents, on the other hand, did have a little bit of an accent and they came over here when they were teens, but still they had that similar struggle of like, how do we fit in? How do we belong? Now we're raising kids and how do we raise them so that our kids are also accepted? So now not only are they trying to be accepted, they're worrying about my sister. And I just look back on that. I'm just like, I'm in awe of how they were able to move through that with the amount of grace that they did. And I do call it grace because sure, there were moments where as a kid, I was frustrated, but I recognize that they truly were doing the best that they could. And that's what I remind each of us as parents too, is we really are doing the best that we can. And it's about leaning into that idea of compassion and empathy.
Yeah. And I wonder how much there was also like trying to juggle the American way of living versus the culture and the norms
Totally.
that
Totally.
they still wanted to hold and bring forward, but also feeling the resistance. And there's a
Oh, yeah.
lot of turmoil that they must have been experiencing.
There was, yes, because for my sister and I, we were putting pressure on them because we're like, but other kids don't do this. And then, of course, they had their own families, right? So they had their parents who wanted them to raise their kids a certain way too, with the cultural norms, because their parents were raised a certain way and they raised. So you have all of these pressures. And it was really giving them a lot of, just in hindsight, they needed a lot more grace than they were probably given in terms of being able to navigate those waters.
Wow. Yeah. I guess, my biggest question is, do you have advice on how others might be able to understand the life of somebody who is different or an immigrant? Or, I go back to that feeling. We all experience the not belonging, but there are some individuals that can't hide the fact that the belonging is a harder thing for them. And is there any advice that you would give? I love asking my teens that I work with to read a story from somebody who is different than them. And, that's my way of like bringing awareness. But do you have thoughts or ideas on how we can become more aware of what it might be like to walk in somebody else's shoes?
Well, I love your idea of having them read a story. I mean, I think for the teens today, utilizing in my work, because I also do a social emotional learning class, I use a lot of movie clips and TV clips because if we look at it and we look at it curiously, we will find evidence in different movies or TV clips that people can relate to. I will also say that this concept of staying curious is really powerful when somebody is different, right? We can see it in the sense of whether it's physically, how they act, whatever it may be. We're noticing, oh, they're different. When the moment you get to that place, that's an invitation for you to get more curious, potentially ask questions of that person, have deep conversations with that person. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that I feel so much more connected and like somebody gets me when they're willing to have the conversation that we're having right now, where they're asking me those types of questions versus just glossing over the difference and pretending it almost doesn't exist. I would much rather us actually converse authentically and transparently about the difference than pretending it doesn't exist. I think for me, it's almost like analogous to conflict avoidance. I'm going to pretend this thing isn't an issue and just kind of gloss over it. Rather, let's actually have true, authentic conversations about it and hold space for people to be different.
Yes, because so much, I would say, my own self-discovery and my own journey into entrepreneurship was really self-reflection and seeing who I really was. And I don't know that we hold space to find out who we are. So it's not a surprise that it's hard for us to try and learn about somebody else when we're like so afraid to know who we are.
Oh my gosh. And yes, I mean, it's fear. Fear holds us back completely, right? We're afraid to know ourselves. And if we're afraid to know ourselves, how can we truly create space to know somebody else?
Yeah. So, how do people find you and what are the ways to connect with you?
They can find me very easily on the web with my name, kaminiwood.com. That's probably the number one way to find me. But of course, I'm on social as well, Facebook and Instagram with the handle It's Authentic Me. Honestly, I'm pretty good about responding to email. So if somebody were to hop onto my website and send me an email, they absolutely could connect with me that way.
That's awesome. I will include that stuff in our show notes. And what an incredible conversation. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing with our high achievers who are afraid to admit that they need help and giving them those tools that they need to avoid the potential burnout that so many adults are experiencing. So, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for having this incredible conversation with me. And
Thank you for this incredible conversation. Such a pleasure.
Yeah, it was so good. And I look forward to more people finding you and preventing that perpetuation of this generational, oh my gosh, it's so true. And it stops with us, right? Like when when we realize what we need to do, we prevent it from happening to our kids. But when we try and prevent it from our kids without looking within, we're unsuccessful.
Right. It's almost a Band-Aid at that point, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are you ready to help the young people in your life unlock their inner strength and step confidently into leadership? The new workbook from Peers Not Fears, Your Voice Matters, Uncovering Your Unique Leadership. It's designed to help teens see the leader in themselves, step by step. It's not just a workbook. It's the first step towards a ripple effect that could change lives. Let's turn today's teens into tomorrow's titans. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Leaders of Today, Teens to Titans. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other parents who might benefit from this conversation. Together, we can support our teens in building healthy, positive relationships and become leaders of tomorrow. Until next time, I'm Lorraine Connell, and this is Leaders of Today, Teens to Titans.